Millsford, Ohio. Summer of 1998. A quiet town where nothing much ever happens. Life moves slowly, neighbors know each other's names, and the biggest headlines usually come from the high school baseball field or the county fair. But on the morning of July 14th, that calm was shattered. The owner of a roadside inn, the Sunrise Motel, noticed something unusual. One of his guests hadn't checked out. His car was still parked outside, but there was no answer to the door. The man hadn't been seen since the night before. And now, there was a strange odor seeping from under the door. Fearing the worst, the manager called the police. When officers forced the door open, they were met with a suffocating smell of stale alcohol and heavy, stagnant air. On the bed lay a man in his late 40s. At first glance, he looked as if he had simply fallen asleep. But he wasn't sleeping. He was dead. The man's ID revealed his name, Robert Hayes, 47 years old. A local resident who had checked in only 2 nights earlier. The room showed no signs of struggle. The television was still on. On the table, an empty whiskey bottle and a packet of sleeping pills. To the officers, the scene suggested a tragic but ordinary end. The first conclusion was straightforward: a heart attack. Robert had a history of drinking. He was overweight, and his medical records showed high blood pressure. It seemed to fit the picture perfectly. But as procedure demanded, the body was sent for an autopsy. And this is where the story took a turn. The case landed on the table of Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a seasoned medical examiner. She had performed hundreds of autopsies throughout her career. To her, every body told a story, if you were willing to listen closely. The first thing she noticed were Robert's lips and fingertips, a bluish discoloration. Not uncommon in cases of heart failure, but something about the shade and pattern bothered her. Then she found something else. Along the man's neck, just beneath the jawline, were tiny red spots, barely visible. At first, they could be dismissed as a rash or minor skin irritation. But Dr. Carter knew better. They were petechial hemorrhages, minute blood vessel ruptures often linked to suffocation. She made a note but kept her thoughts to herself. To speculate too early could mislead the investigation. Still, a question gnawed at her: was this really a natural death? The autopsy continued. Robert's internal organs bore the marks of long-term alcohol abuse, but there were no signs of a massive heart attack. His heart was enlarged, yes, but not fatally so. His lungs, however, told another story: they were congested, filled with fluid. It didn't add up. Dr. Carter decided to wait for the toxicology results. Perhaps Robert had overdosed on alcohol combined with sleeping pills. That could explain the sudden death. A tragic accident, nothing more. But deep down, her instincts told her there was more to uncover. Meanwhile, detectives began digging into Robert's personal life. He was an auto mechanic, a man of routine, described by neighbors as quiet but friendly. Recently divorced, he had been living with a woman named Linda Martin, 12 years his junior. Their relationship was intense, often stormy. Passion one night, shouting matches the next. According to Linda, she and Robert had argued the night before. She claimed she left the motel in anger and spent the night at a friend's house. To the police, her explanation seemed plausible. Couples fight, people storm out, it happens. But back in the morgue, Dr. Carter couldn't shake the unease. The more she looked at Robert Hayes, the more she was convinced his body was hiding a secret. And very soon, the truth would begin to surface. The body of Robert Hayes lay on the examination table. For most investigators, the case was already closed. A heavy drinker, overweight, a stressful life, heart attack or overdose seemed the obvious answers. But for Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the signs didn't align so neatly. She began her detailed autopsy, step by step. The external exam revealed very little: no major bruises, no defensive wounds, no obvious trauma. To anyone else, it looked ordinary. But Carter's eye was drawn again to those tiny red dots on Robert's neck, the petechial hemorrhages. They whispered of oxygen deprivation, not a failing heart. Next, she examined the lungs. They were congested, swollen, heavy with fluid. That could happen during a heart attack, but it could also happen in cases of suffocation. Carter wrote it down, her suspicions mounting. Now came the toxicology tests. Samples of blood, urine, and tissue were carefully packed and sent to the lab. Days later, the results came back. Robert's blood contained a high level of alcohol, almost twice the legal limit for driving. Alongside it, traces of barbiturates, a sedative found in sleeping pills. A dangerous combination. But here was the twist: the levels were not fatal. They could have made him drowsy, even unconscious. But they could not have killed him outright. For Carter, the puzzle pieces were shifting. If alcohol and pills didn't end his life, then what did? She returned to the body for a second, closer look. Under the microscope, samples from Robert's airway revealed something unusual: small fibers lodged deep inside the throat. Foreign material that didn't belong there. When compared to samples taken from the motel room, the match was clear. The fibers were from the motel's pillows. It was a chilling discovery. Robert Hayes hadn't simply passed out from drink. Someone had pressed a pillow over his face while he was sedated, long enough to silence him forever. The case had transformed. What police had dismissed as natural death now looked like homicide. Detectives were forced to reopen the investigation. Who would want Robert Hayes dead? They looked again at his companion, Linda Martin. She had lived with him for months, shared his money, his home, his bed. Witnesses described her as affectionate in public, but also volatile. Neighbors recalled shouting matches late at night. One friend admitted Robert had confided in him. Linda was pressuring him about finances. When questioned again, Linda stuck to her story. She said she left the motel after a heated argument and went to a friend's place. That friend, however, couldn't fully confirm her timeline. Some hours of the night remained unaccounted for. Detectives pressed harder. Why had Linda left Robert alone? Why didn't she return in the morning when she knew he was drinking heavily and taking pills? Her answers were evasive, contradictory. Then another detail emerged. Just weeks earlier, Robert had taken out a life insurance policy, with Linda Martin listed as the sole beneficiary. The amount was substantial, enough to raise eyebrows, and enough to raise suspicion. Investigators now had motive, opportunity, and a medical examiner's findings that pointed to murder. Still, Linda denied everything. Robert was troubled, she told detectives. He drank too much. He was sick. He did this to himself. But Dr. Carter's report told a different story. Alcohol and pills had only weakened Robert. It was the pillow that ended his life. Someone had been in that motel room with him, and that someone had pressed down until he stopped breathing. The noose of suspicion was tightening around Linda Martin. Yet detectives knew, suspicion alone wouldn't be enough in court. They needed something stronger, solid, undeniable proof. And soon, they would find it. The discovery of pillow fibers in Robert Hayes's airway had changed everything. What police once believed to be a natural death was now officially a homicide investigation. For Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the case was a reminder of how fragile the line between accident and murder could be. Without her meticulous examination, Robert's death might have been signed off as just another statistic, a drunk who went too far. But the fibers told a darker story. Now detectives needed to know who had held that pillow down. The focus was back on Linda Martin, Robert's girlfriend. Her relationship with Robert was messy, fueled by alcohol, arguments, and money problems. The recent life insurance policy only deepened suspicion. But suspicion wasn't proof. Investigators needed evidence that tied Linda directly to the crime. They started by re-examining the motel room. On the surface, it had looked clean. But forensic teams used special lights and chemical sprays to search for trace evidence invisible to the naked eye. That's when they found it: faint impressions on the pillow's fabric, patterns that could match fingerprints or hand pressure. The prints were partial, blurred, not enough for a perfect match. But one sample revealed characteristics consistent with Linda's hand size and shape. It wasn't conclusive, but it pushed the case further in her direction. Then came the timeline. Detectives tracked Linda's movements on the night Robert died. She claimed she left the motel late in the evening after a fight, went to a friend's house, and stayed the night. The problem? The friend admitted Linda hadn't shown up until nearly 3 a.m. That left a 4-hour gap unaccounted for, the same hours when Robert likely died. Detectives confronted her with the inconsistency. Linda's response was shaky, defensive. She insisted she had simply driven around, cooling off after the argument. But when pressed for details, where she drove, which streets, what gas station she stopped at, her answers changed each time. And there was more. Credit card records showed that earlier that evening, before the fight, Linda had purchased over-the-counter sleeping aids at a local pharmacy, the exact type later found in Robert's bloodstream. Piece by piece, the puzzle was taking shape. To prosecutors, it looked like this. Linda slipped the pills into Robert's drink that night, waited for him to grow drowsy, then smothered him with a pillow. She counted on alcohol and barbiturates making the death appear accidental, and hoped the medical examiner would call it heart failure. With Robert gone, she stood to collect a hefty insurance payout. But Linda underestimated Dr. Carter. The autopsy results, the pillow fibers, the toxicology reports, together, they painted a chilling picture. Yet investigators knew jurors needed more than science. They needed to feel the motive, to understand the greed that could turn a partner into a killer. So detectives dug deeper into Linda's life. They learned she had mounting debts, including unpaid credit cards and overdue rent. She had recently quit her job, telling friends she wouldn't have to worry about money much longer. Her words now sounded ominous. The case against Linda Martin was growing stronger by the day. But in the eyes of the law, suspicion and circumstantial evidence were not enough. Detectives still needed the final piece, the undeniable link that would turn theory into certainty. And soon, they would have it. The investigation into Robert Hayes's death was no longer about whether it was murder. That much was clear. Now, the question was who had slipped into that motel room, held down the pillow, and watched Robert's last breath fade away. All signs pointed to one person, Linda Martin. But detectives needed to know more about the woman who had shared Robert's life. Who was she, really? On the surface, Linda was charming, lively, a woman who enjoyed nights out, nice clothes, and expensive dinners. She was younger than Robert, attractive, and seemed to enjoy the stability he provided. But beneath that surface, another story emerged, a story of debts, desperation, and deceit. When detectives traced her financial history, they uncovered a trail of overdue bills. Credit cards maxed out. A repossessed car. Rent in arrears. Linda was drowning in debt. Friends recalled her constant complaints about money, how she envied others who had it easy. And then came the most telling detail. The life insurance policy. Only months before his death, Robert Hayes had signed a new policy worth $150,000. Linda was the sole beneficiary. To investigators, it looked less like coincidence and more like premeditation. Neighbors and acquaintances painted a picture of a turbulent relationship. Arguments were frequent, sometimes explosive. Robert's co-workers remembered him coming in with scratches on his arms, once with a bruised face. He brushed it off as fights at home, but it raised suspicions now. Even Robert himself seemed uneasy. In the weeks before his death, he confided in a colleague, if something happens to me, don't be surprised if Linda's involved." That chilling statement would later echo in court. Detectives also discovered that Linda had been in contact with another man, a casual boyfriend she kept on the side. Phone records showed late-night calls, even while she was living with Robert. To prosecutors, this revealed motive beyond money. Robert was an obstacle. Linda wanted his money, but not the burden of his presence. The picture was coming together. Financial desperation. A stormy, sometimes violent relationship. A secret lover. And now, the opportunity, being with Robert in that motel room the night he died. But Linda stuck to her story. She denied involvement, insisted she left after an argument, and claimed Robert must have overdosed alone. When confronted with the insurance policy, she shrugged, "Robert wanted to take care of me. He loved me." Still, the evidence was piling up. The fibers in his throat. The inconsistent alibi. The purchase of sleeping pills. The motive of financial gain. For detectives, it was becoming clear, Robert Hayes hadn't died by chance. He had been silenced by the very woman he trusted. The shadow of Linda Martin loomed larger over the case. Yet there was still one hurdle. Defense attorneys could argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had actually seen Linda smother Robert, that the fibers could have been accidental, the drugs voluntary. To secure a conviction, prosecutors needed to tighten the case, close every gap, and prove beyond doubt that Linda was the killer. And as the investigation pressed forward, they would uncover just enough to bring her to trial. By now, detectives were convinced, Robert Hayes's death was no accident. It was murder. And the prime suspect was the woman who should have cared for him most, his girlfriend, Linda Martin. But suspicion alone couldn't secure a conviction. The law demanded proof. Clear, undeniable, inescapable proof. And so, investigators went back to the evidence. At the crime lab, technicians re-examined the fibers found in Robert's throat. They weren't just random strands of fabric. Under high-powered magnification, they revealed a unique weave pattern, specific to the pillows used at the Sunrise Motel. The conclusion was clear, Robert had been suffocated with bedding from his very own motel room. He didn't choke by accident. Someone had pressed that pillow down until he could no longer breathe. Next came the toxicology. Robert's bloodstream showed a combination of alcohol and sedatives. Alone, neither was lethal. Together, they were powerful enough to leave him disoriented, unable to resist. Someone had ensured Robert was defenseless before finishing the job. But who? Detectives retraced Linda's steps on the night of Robert's death. They found the receipt for the sleeping pills, purchased only hours before. They confronted her with it. Linda insisted the pills were for herself, claiming she often had trouble sleeping. But combined with Robert's toxicology, the timing was too perfect to ignore. The timeline gap also worked against her. Linda claimed she left Robert around 11 p.m. after an argument. Yet her friend admitted Linda didn't arrive at her house until nearly 3 a.m. That left 4 crucial hours unaccounted for, the exact window in which Robert was killed. Detectives knew Linda was lying. They also uncovered a chilling detail: the insurance policy Robert had taken out just months before his death. Linda was the sole beneficiary. The payout, $150,000. To a woman drowning in debt, it was motive enough for murder. But the strongest blow came from Robert himself. His own words. 2 of his co-workers recalled Robert's warning: "If something happens to me, don't be surprised if Linda's behind it." It was the kind of statement juries never forget. With each new piece of evidence, the puzzle came together. The picture it formed was unmistakable. Linda Martin had drugged Robert Hayes. She waited until he was weak, drifting in and out of consciousness. Then she pressed a pillow over his face and held it there until his life was gone. All so she could walk away free, wealthy, and unburdened. But Linda had underestimated one thing: science. The careful work of a medical examiner, the patience of forensic analysts, the persistence of detectives. Each detail she overlooked became a brick in the case against her. For prosecutors, it was now a race to gather every thread into one tight, unbreakable narrative. Soon, Linda would face trial for murder. And in that courtroom, the battle for justice would begin. The courtroom was tense. For weeks, the town of Millsford had followed the story. The death of Robert Hayes had gone from a quiet, tragic incident to a case that captivated an entire community. And now, the person at the center of it all, Linda Martin, faced justice. Prosecutors presented their case with precision. They recounted the evidence piece by piece. The toxicology report showing alcohol and sedatives in Robert's bloodstream. The fibers from the motel pillow found lodged in his throat. Linda's inconsistent alibi, leaving her unaccounted for during the critical hours of Robert's death. The life insurance policy naming her as sole beneficiary. Her financial struggles and growing desperation. Each point was accompanied by testimony from detectives, forensic experts, and medical examiners. Dr. Elizabeth Carter took the stand, walking the jury through the autopsy findings. She explained the petechial hemorrhages on Robert's neck, the signs of suffocation, and the way the fibers and chemicals combined to ensure his death. The defense tried to challenge the science, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested that Robert could have choked by accident, that the sedatives and alcohol alone were enough to explain his death, and that Linda had no direct proof tying her to the act. But the prosecution countered relentlessly. Each inconsistency in her statements was highlighted. Every lie about her whereabouts became another thread weaving her into the narrative of murder. Witnesses confirmed her financial desperation, and the timeline left no plausible opportunity for anyone else to commit the crime. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the jury was absorbing the meticulous reconstruction of events. The evidence wasn't just scientific, it was human. The warning from Robert himself, the relationships, the greed, the anger. All of it painted a portrait of a calculated crime. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Linda Martin was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was pronounced, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, the town exhaled. Justice, painstakingly assembled from microscopic fibers, toxicology reports, and witness testimonies, had been served. For Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the case was a reminder of why her work mattered. Behind every autopsy table was a story waiting to be told, a story that, if ignored, might let a killer walk free. Through her meticulous attention to detail, through the science of death, the truth had finally emerged. Robert Hayes's life had been stolen, but the careful work of forensic investigation ensured his death did not go unanswered. And in Millsford, the story of the Sunrise Motel murder would be remembered. Not just for the crime itself, but for the way a life could be reconstructed from the smallest, most telling details.